This is the build I'll probably be league starting with in 3.21. It's a cold DoT Trickster using Eldritch Battery and Mind Over Matter, and I'll be loading this up in the hardcore trade league come day 3, day 4. And just a heads up, this is probably the last video I'll be dropping before league start happens. I sort of see cold DoT this league as choosing between two primary options, and they both use EBMOM. Trickster on one hand gives you better avoidance, speed, decent damage, and really solid recovery. On the other, I think Hierophant is another great option. It lets you run 5 50% auras, or 4 50% auras plus Discipline and Defiance banner. Really powerful, especially given changes to aura reservation. So I've also linked a Hierophant POB if you prefer more of a consistent defense, better fizz reduction, bigger pool, but slightly slower playstyle and slightly more difficult to gear early on. While this build isn't necessarily novel, it's something that I've playtested fairly well, and I've spent quite a while crafting and thinking about the decisions I want to make during this build's progression so that I can have a really smooth playstyle. Ultimately, my goal with this build is to create something that I can probably play for about 100 hours, really comfortably farming both the league content and maps in general, while I gear for probably the most risky transition build I've ever tried to play in hardcore trade. So the tree should look fairly straightforward, concentrated in the shadow area, but dipping over to Witch for a little bit and Ranger down a little bit. But it's a tree that gives you a lot of things quite easily. I want to adjust something first. Usually I wouldn't go down to Ranger on a cold DoT build, but Heart of Oak nodes are able to better give me access to stun immunity, something that's really important when you're playing with a relatively low life pool. This tree also gets a ton of suppression off the base. You get a mix of Quick Step, the small node leading into it, the Instinct Cluster, and of course Spellbreaker from Trickster. In terms of the tree itself, I'm looking for things like damage over time, elemental damage, non-damaging ailment scaling, and of course, clicking a ton of masteries everywhere you can because of Polymath on Trickster giving you damage and better mapping recovery every time you click a mastery node that's unique. I'm clicking a lot of major keystones, including Mind Over Matter, which gives you a huge ES pool when you combine it with Eldritch Battery, and Trickster's Escape Artist, which gives you a solid amount of ES and a solid amount of evasion. I'm also taking Wind Dancer on this POB and skipping Determination altogether, something that Dan sort of did last league. You do have some other sources of Fizz DR that you can build on gear, but in general, I see the avoidance level and the suppression that Trickster gives as being sufficient to enable you to actually skip armor entirely. I've playtested this a couple times through, and my last Fire DoT run was without Determination, so I think it actually might be fine. But Wind Dancer, especially when you're approaching about 40k mapping evasion, is quite an efficient defense, and if you think about the types of encounters that you fight, especially while mapping, it's actually a pretty solid node. I think the rest of the tree should be fairly easy to follow. Just to note that I am taking this Mana Mastery because you do need reservation efficiency to fit in all your auras on a Trickster, and also I go for the Tolerance wheel now. So in past, I would have gone for one with evil, but that's been moved over here. And the reason why I'd probably take this wheel, especially early on, is because Chaos Res is really the weak point of this. You're running with a hybrid pool, but a lot of your effective HP is actually Energy Shield, which can't mitigate against chaos damage. So in my opinion, you probably want to be entering maps with about, 30-ish, 40-ish Chaos Res, ideally. As far as the Ascendancy node goes, there's some mobility here. So as I'm going through campaign, I actually would probably start with one step ahead first. This makes your campaign much quicker, gives you early chill and freeze immunity before you can build it onto gear. After that, I'm going for Escape Artist and Spellbreaker hand in hand. It doesn't really matter to get this node early, but if you get this and you have a relatively strong evasion chest, you might be able to go Eldritch Battery fairly early. Finally, I go for Polymath with my Uber Lab. And then as I approach the end game and I'm able to craft my gear, getting ailment avoidance on multiple pieces of gear, I then switch out one step ahead for Swift Killer. And the reason why I do this is that even though you give up speed in some form by losing the action speed, firstly, cold DoT builds always have chills, so you're not really benefiting from that nearby enemy's action speed is at most 90% face value. And secondly, Swift Killer is really powerful for Vol Cold Snap. It makes it so that your frenzy generation on bosses is actually much more consistent, and it also pairs really well with endurance charge on kill. Basically, if you have an endurance charge on kill ring, you should be able to maintain that all through maps because you have 30-second charges. It's an underrated node for sure, even on non-frenzy stackers, but definitely something I only go for in the late game after I've already built in my immunities so that I can drop one step ahead. Speaking of gear, it should be fairly straightforward. It's fairly easy to craft most of the stuff, and this is very SSF friendly because who knows how many people will be playing HC trade this economy. For DoT builds, plus gem levels is disproportionately powerful, so I'm using a quality recipe, just 40 quality of total cold gems with a wand, and then I'm multi-modding cold DoT multi and spell damage, or cold damage if you want. My shield, I'm looking for things like this. Probably not going to be able to hit this. I would prioritize that +1 cold likely, but more important is that you really want to hit that avoid ailments. This is a harvest craft in all likelihood, reforged cold. You might be able to look for fractures, especially that avoid ailments fracture tends to be pretty common. I have benchcrafted suppression here, but it's not actually necessary. I might look for other things like, 3% PDR, which is sort of like having a crafted endurance charge, curse effect, chaos res craft. It's really quite flexible. My helmet has double fizz as modifiers. The implicit has a fizz damage from his taken as lightning, and then I'm using the betrayal corral mod for fizz taken as fire. Otherwise, suppression, ES, evasion, that sort of thing, very simple. The Sadist Garb is my body armor of choice. It synergizes really well with Escape Artist, giving you a ton of ES. And just like the shield, you'll need to hit avoid ailments here so that you can hit avoid ailment cap. However, you don't need to actually go for the Veil mod. Benchcrafting this should be more than sufficient. My gloves are where I put my cold snap, and in this case, I'm just using an essence of Delirium, giving you 30% more damage over time on any sort of solid fractured, probably evasion based, but not necessary again. And then I finish that off with either a Unveil Ashling 4 for +2 AoE, or I just gave up and benchcraft +1 AoE. The implicits are really interesting. A lot of people would opt for exposure on the implicit. I'm actually opting for cold damage leech because I do have free sockets because I'm running fewer auras than, say, a cold dot Hierophant. And this life leech is actually pretty beneficial, especially while you're mapping hitting a ton of targets. You'll tend to have decent leech rate. Exposure from Frostbomb is fine. I think Frostbomb is also nice because it can disable recovery on Maven encounters. The boots are where the majority of your ailment avoidance actually comes from, and the implicits on this are really quite important and probably the more difficult part of the scaling process. Scorch Ground is a really big offensive mod, and then you can finish off with this pair of boots can be finished off in a bunch of different ways. As long as you're hitting move speed, I think that could be fine. I might Veil Chaos Craft this. I might just end up with a multi-mod at the end, multi-modding both movement speed, onslaught on kill, and avoid ailments. But it's really the implicits on boots that matter. On the amulet, I've just identified two really obviously powerful offensive mods, damage over time multi and cold skill gems. The benchcraft for non-damaging ailments is really great for cold dot builds, especially if you're using Bone Chill, Scorch, and Focus Shock, which I do have over on this ring. On the other ring, it's going to be min endurance charge on kill. And there's a bunch of open affixes here because you really need to have, resistances, defense, life, whatever it may be. My Stitch Advice only has one mandatory modifier. It's this regen 150 energy shield per second while there's a rare or unique enemy nearby. It tops up your recovery. So you already have Ghost Dance recovery, which is about 900 per time you get hit. And you also have Leech from the tree. This also gives you base regen for your ES. I'd also look probably for life regen if you could on the belt. Fairly flexible slot again, and flash modifiers are also pretty good to look for. The Abyss Shield you pair with the Stitch Advice only has one mandatory requirement for my POV, it's Avoid Stun. You're also looking for life, but this is really the main important modifier. In combination with pathing through Heart of Oak and also taking a single little small stun avoidance node here, and the Benchcraft on your chest, you're able to hit complete stun avoidance, and I do think this is actually quite valuable. Especially since you're able to get elemental ailment immunity, that lets you completely drop solo Brine King and opt for one of these two. I especially like Lunaris because I think this really helps you survive maps. Guard Khan is a small pantheon I take early on. Later, that becomes Relicash once you build shock immunity. And obviously, you can go into Abrath when you're farming Exile. So the gem sockets are fairly straightforward, and they're not super flexible, but they're also not super tight. There's like one or two sockets of flexibility, depending on how many buttons you're willing to press. The main 6-king setup is Vortex, Creeping Frost. That Divergent Alt Qual can make your mapping a little bit nicer, but generally this is fairly standard. The other damage setup is my Vol Cold Snap, and these are in those gloves I've mentioned, and this is where your Bone Chill lives, your Control Destruction, and I opt for efficacy even though there's better damage scores. The main reason is that I like to have decent duration on my Vol Cold Snap, and if you see here, my VCS actually has a duration of 6.6 seconds, which feels quite nice when you're mapping. I think this is roughly a solid duration. Sometimes I like to get a little bit more if possible, but this checks out as feeling pretty good. My main auras include Discipline, Malevolence, and Grace, and then I'm running a Divine Blessing with Hatred. You can also opt for Zealotry. It might be better because you do get decent Consecrated Gown uptime. My move skill choice is Frostblink, and then over here I'm running my dual curse Frostbite with LE Weak and also Frostbomb. You do have space to Arcanist Brand this. If you drop Arcanist Brand, manually cast all these things. Maybe move Frostbomb to the Glove Implicit if you want to give the Leech. Finally, I have my Guard skill with a Mortal Call, cast damage taken. This really shores up that multi-hit, which is the main scary thing you're dealing with while you're mapping as a Trickster. So it's a fairly bare bones build, but one that I think is really efficient, really quick, easy to gear, and able to cover every single major defensive checkpoint in the game. Your Fizz damage reduction is a little bit on the lower side, but especially when you have Swift Killer and Endurance Charge Generation, and you can even try to hit a Benchcraft here for Gravicius for 12% Fizz as. I should be able to survive most things, and it's a build I pretty much want to play to level 100. The big reason why, though, is that I want to transition into this thing later. It looks super troll. It's pretty much a softcore pure bosser, an Ice Trap, Badge of the Brotherhood, Ralakesh, Ice Trap Assassin. But basically my goal come this league is to try to play a build like this in hardcore. This is really only to do two things: farm Uber Eater and farm Uber Exarch. And based on what I've seen, this is a pretty efficient way to hit the threshold where you can actually one-shot Uber bosses right when they spawn. It's sort of the reach goal for me and something I'm aiming to play, and one of the big drivers behind why I'm loading up a Shadow on League Start instead of a Templar. The early leveling of this build isn't quite what it used to be. Obviously, you no longer have Onslaught or the Wandcrafts. That said, I still encourage a Stormblast Mine plus Orb of Storms plus Frostbomb setup for the early game, just because the synergy between, really fast mine throw speed and Orb of Storms and Swift Assembly is quite powerful. But you're also able to take early Saboteur, quite a strong node. The main difference is that after I kill Mervale, I'm actually going to swap over to Fire Trap, and one of the big reasons that Snowforge is sort of the next cluster, the next big damage cluster you want to opt for, and this doesn't scale lightning damage. Fire Trap also has really nice clear through your early acts. You just link it with Elemental Proliferation and Combustion, although you will need to buy both of those support gems. I stay on the Fire DoT setup for quite a while, at least till level 28, and you do use Summon Skitter Boss the whole way through. There's a chance I would even consider staying Fire Trap and pair that with the Flame Wall all the way until maybe like Chamber of Innocence, because while Cold Dot is really strong later, the early gems for Cold Dot just don't do that much damage for some reason. If you really do want to swap though, at level 28 you can, and you can put in Vortex, Cold Snap, and Creeping Frost as your primary setup. Early on, I'd actually go for Arcane Expanse right away. And then pretty soon after, you'll want to do some yucky looking pathing over here because practical application early is quite nice. I'd even continue further and grab Arcanist Dominion and Frostwalker because, again, early res on this tree really scarce, but really strong. Once you go into Cold Dot, you'll start valuing cast speed much more, and that goes over here. But one of the big things that will help you out this league is this Mastery. Again, Cold Dot is a multiple skill kind of build, and if you pair this with Flame Dash during your leveling, that means you have Flame Dash, Creeping Frost, and Cold Snap. So this is giving you, 18% cast speed right off the bat. As you're pushing in towards Act 4, Act 5, I'd go for another AoE node. And then you'll want to push for some of the really nice Cold Dot nodes. Something like Glacial Cage would give you a lot of single target damage later on, but I'd probably look to be grabbing maybe this Aura node over here, grabbing this, respecting these two, grabbing the Cold node and respecting this fire damage, and getting down over here. Just because I really like having my auras early. This skill effect duration is also quite valuable, especially when you're lower cast speed. But generally speaking, I think a tree that looks something like this should be enough to carry you all the way until like Merc Lab. You can fill out the nodes with everything else, as you're approaching it, but you don't need to click Mastery nodes. The big thing is that you grab Whispers of Doom when you feel a single target is lacking. And just make sure you don't click Mind Over Matter, especially before you get Cruel Lab. Cruel Lab is the earliest I click this, and you really want to be pairing this also with Discipline and grabbing one of the single leash nodes, either this one over here or this one over here. They are the exact same thing. And then just to keep in mind some final things, the stun avoidance stuff, Wind Dancer, this really comes last, as does clicking some of the mastery. It's like this region 2% mastery, the suppression mastery. These are the sort of things that'll come after Polymath. It logically follows, it should make sense to you. Anyways, I'm sorry to check out so early in the pre-patch. I really like making a lot of builds, and there's a couple things that I still think are strong. I think Viper Strike's got a lot of potential. Obviously, the TR, Caustic Arrow sort of things are looking really good with the new Pathfinder. Melee, especially in the early leveling, as a Slayer, has never looked stronger. Something like Bone Shatter is my guess as the actual top fast progression league starter, and I think we'll definitely see a resurgence of bow builds this league. But when it comes to what I want to do, I'm going to play it safe, I'm going to play it smooth, and I want to really just vibe. And I think that's exactly what a Cold Dot Trickster accomplishes.